Good evening. From Columbia, South Carolina, welcome to a special firing line debate on the subject that concerns Americans most these days, according to every recent poll, illegal drugs. Our question tonight is, should drugs be legalized? I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. William F. Buckley, Jr., founder and star of Firing Line, founder and editor-in-chief of the National Review. Mr. Buckley once famously smoked marijuana while on his yacht in international waters. He thinks marijuana should be available to everyone, but he's still a Republican. He doesn't think the same about yachts. Judge Robert Sweet of New York became famous just last December when a private lecture he gave urging drug legalization mysteriously appeared on page 1 of the New York Times. Judge Sweet has been on the bench for 12 years and before that was a federal prosecutor, so he does know what he's talking about. Ira Glasser has been executive director of the ACLU since 1978. During that time, practically no one has burned the American flag, so I guess Mr. Glasser is a failure in that regard. Richard Dennis made one of the legendary fortunes of recent decades by trading commodities. Mr. Dennis is an active political thinker and writer, president of New Perspectives Quarterly, and part owner of that prominent Midwestern political think tank, the Chicago White Sox. Representative Pat Schroeder, Democrat of Colorado, who has served in Congress since 1973. She's now the senior woman in Congress. Even if she never runs for president, as many have urged, her place in history will be assured as the person who first used the word Teflon in connection with Ronald Reagan. Representative Charles Rangel, Democrat of New York, is chairman of the House Select Committee on Narcotics. For 2 decades, he has represented a district, Harlem, that has suffered some of the worst ravages of drugs. Newt Gingrich, a congressman from Georgia since 1978, used to be one of the attack dogs of the Republican right. Then last year he joined the party leadership as minority whip. So now he's one of the leader dogs of the American Republican right. And finally, William Von Raab was U.S. Commissioner of Customs for 8 years until he got fired last year for saying publicly that George Bush's drug war is not tough enough. His suggestions for making it tougher include shooting down airplanes suspected of carrying drugs and, Mr. Buckley, please note, confiscating yachts on which small quantities of drugs are
There will be blood on this venerable floor if anybody on the other team suggests tonight that I or my colleagues are soft on the drug question. I consider drugs the second worst menace to our society, the first being ignorance. It is that ignorance we are attempting tonight to diminish. The ignorance that believes that $15 billion per year, jail cells for every third college student, a national obsession with a lost cause, is the most sensible way to the formulation of the national drug policy. Understand this, we are not here with a solution to the drug problem. As well search out a solution to the problem of alcoholism, or for that matter, adultery. We do believe that those who take psychoactive drugs and become addicts, which is to say, somewhere between 8 and 10% of those who consume drugs are human beings with problems, in part psychological, in part genetic, which are clumsily explored by seeking to cart them off to jail, in particular, since if everyone in America who had ever taken a proscribed substance were put in jail, which would presumably mean the triumph of Mr. Bush's drug program, there would be almost as many beds in American jails as in American homes. There is something disconcerting about that prospect. We favor a fresh approach which would begin by declining to prosecute drug consumers. Drug merchants we would not need to worry about since they would disappear, their profit motive having gone. And then finally, we would devote ourselves to seeking out the reasons for this ravaging weakness and concentrate our resources on treating those who will be treated and educating those who will be educated. But in doing so, under the fresh approach, we would have made some headway against the ignorance of present policies, which ignorance I now invite you to listen to.
The trouble with drugs is the crime that comes from that. That certainly is a critical part, and we will be addressing that. But the trouble with drugs is also the use of drugs. And we must not forget what a drug usage does. To say it's a victimless crime is really incorrect. It tears at the fabric of families, it tears at the whole society fabric, and I think that we really have to be very, very serious about this. I think a lot of people also will try to convince you that if people engage in crime to buy illegal drugs, they're going to engage in crime to buy legal drugs. I mean, the reason people engage in crime is to buy VCRs, new tennis shoes, drugs, or whatever they want.
After 12 years on the bench, I conclude that our present drug laws don't work and that we must regulate, not criminalize, drug use. 35 million Americans have used mind-altering drugs. Some 6.5 million are abusers. The drug industry, untaxed, unsupervised, illegal, is a major industry, about $150 billion a year, operating at a profit margin of 5,000%. Since 1917, we've made drug use illegal. This year, we'll put more than 1 million prisoners in jail, more proportionately than any other industrialized nation except South Africa. Congress will spend over $10 billion this year. More prisoners, more money, more addicts, a sort of domestic Vietnam. We have to reduce the harm caused by drug use, squeeze the money out of the business, eliminate the street crime and the drug dealers, shift our dollars from jails and interdiction into research and care, and deal with addiction as a disease, not a crime.
I think it's outrageous now that people are seeking freedom and hope all over the world and coming to the United States that we would lower our standards to that of any drug-pushing country. If you can't pay for it, I assume you would not discriminate against the poor, and we would have drug stamps, or we'll cover it by Medicaid, or perhaps we would say that we'll find a legal way to cut it off for people that are under 21 years old, and protect our children the same way we protected them against alcohol. It's a big laugh to think that we enforce the drug laws in this country. You got to have pretty bad luck to be busted by a federal agent.
If that's accurate, and that there is a disrespect for the law, and if in many cities you can get drugs any way you want, any time you want, if that's the case, then isn't it time that we faced that reality and gave up this business of trying to say that it's illegal and that people have to go to jail for it, and say instead, let's recognize the reality and let's identify these people and treat them?
The central question that faces us is whether or not we should deal with our drug problem as a criminal matter or as a public health matter. Whether we should try to deal with our drug problem in approximately the same way we deal with our alcoholism problem and our cigarette problem, or whether we should try to deal with it as if it were a rape or an assault or a murder. The fact of the matter is that, as everybody knows, the present system has been a failure for years. Our drug problem is out of control. Ask yourself if the problem is worse now than it was 5 years ago. Ask yourself if there's more crime in the street, if people are getting gunned down, if there's a state of siege out there. Ask yourself if we have failed to interdict drugs and stop the supply. Ask yourself if the crime has gotten worse. Ask yourself if we've reduced demand. We have done none of those things. We have had far more success in reducing the problem of nicotine addiction and alcoholism than we have in reducing any other drug. And we have done it without criminal penalties, without an increase in crime, without enriching the criminal cartels, without corrupting the police, and without spending fortunes of money on fruitless efforts at law enforcement that nobody, even the people on the other side of this debate, appear to agree with. This is a disaster of a policy. It has resulted in our drug problem being out of control. It has resulted in enhancing the AIDS epidemic. It is a mistake, and it is necessary for us to begin looking at other examples that have worked in other countries and that have worked here with respect to other drugs.
Why doesn't the system work? The system doesn't work because it is not a tough system. We have decriminalized drugs as a practical matter. Congressman Rangel is right. The chances of being busted by a federal agent are about as remote as you could imagine. There is no genuine fear or threat on the part of any drug user or any low-level drug trafficker that he or she will be punished. Notice, I didn't necessarily say talked to by a policeman, harassed by a policeman, or arrested, but punished. That is what has to happen. We are losing because we are not tough on drugs. Everyone knows it.
The trick is not to arrest 1.5 million people or 3 million people or 5 million people. The trick is to send the signal that the certainty of being caught and the certainty of going to jail is sufficiently high that it's an irrational decision to engage in the business.
We should have learned by now that government isn't the greater power that's going to save us from ourselves. 9 out of 10 Americans don't use illegal drugs. The 9 out of 10 people who do use illegal drugs don't become addicts. It's a pipe dream to think that by law we can save 1 in 100 of us from self-destruction. There is no justification for inflicting on society the costs of keeping drugs illegal. Let me be specific about those costs. In the 2 hours we're spending here tonight, and every 2 hours, at all levels, we spend $6 million on law enforcement. That money could treat the majority of addicts in this country. During the same period, the high cost of these drugs will cause 1,000 crimes, $2 million in stolen property. During the same 2-hour period, 60 people will be arrested for mere possession of marijuana, a criminal misuse of resources.
Let me start by citing The Economist, which recently has said that they favor legalizing drugs. They wrote a full page on the joys of Holland, and I think it's useful to return to a certain amount of common sense and reality in this debate. This is their quote from their description of crime in Amsterdam. Prudent diners out put chains on their bicycles or deposit their car radio in the cloakroom. Now, I just want to suggest this is in a legalized drug environment where they have reduced the incentive for crime.
Would you do that in New York?
People take their car radio and put it in the cloakroom. I just want to start with this point. There is no panacea here. That hard drugs are a real problem, that they are in fact a real threat to society, and that even in the most radical experiment in Europe, which is the Dutch experiment, there is still sufficient level of crime that people take their car radio in to make sure it doesn't get ripped off while they're having dinner.
Mr. Buckley.
Ms. Gingrich, the article from The Economist from which you just finished quoting begins by saying that there has been a relative diminution in the criminal rate in Amsterdam, but that there is still petty crime, which is why people lock up their bicycles. We don't suggest that legalization is going to eliminate crime, but by contrast, people in America have to lock up their maidenheads when they go out. The kind of risk run from a missing bicycle or missing VCR is not really the kind of thing that arrests our attention. What does is the number of people who get murdered, raped, stolen from, and otherwise mutilated.
40% of college freshmen smoked marijuana in the last year. That's more than smoked tobacco. As a parent, why don't you see that the law is more of a threat than the drugs are?
I don't understand any relationship between legalizing drugs and making America's streets safer. It doesn't seem to me that most of the people who engage in the crimes you described, particularly crimes that involve rape, that are violence against person, as distinct from crimes to get money, that those have any relationship to legalizing drugs.
I'll tell you what, let me ask you what the relationship is. When Al Capone killed people, he didn't do so because he was drunk. And when drug dealers shoot people, it is not because they are high. Homicide, the leading cause of homicide in most American cities today is drug traffickers. Disputes over dealers, not under the influence of the drug, but disputes over dealerships, disputes over debts, disputes over prices.
Stop right
Increasingly, people are getting killed, innocent people. What kind of crime do you think that is?